Welcome, dear listener, to Family Revenge Secrets. This is a place where stories are told not simply to entertain, but to remind us of the fragile threads that hold families together. If you find meaning in these voices, I invite you to subscribe, because each story here is another candle lit in the darkness of family secrets. Today's story is called The Voice on the Baby Monitor. I have lived 50 years, and I thought by now I understood the quiet of a house at night. You know the kind I mean, the kind of silence that follows after the dishwasher hums its last cycle, when the porch light flickers against the lawn, and the rest of the world seems to exhale and settle into dreams. In that silence, I often found my peace. My days were full enough, cooking meals, folding laundry, holding my grandson against my chest while he drifted into sleep. My son worked long hours, my daughter-in-law often returned late, and so I became the steady heartbeat of this house. I did it willingly. After all, mothers are trained in sacrifice. It becomes as natural as breathing. But one night, that silence was broken. I was sitting in the kitchen, a mug of chamomile cooling in my hands when the baby monitor crackled to life. At first, I thought it was just static. Old wires, cheap plastic, it was nothing unusual. Then I heard it, a song, not just any song, a lullaby. It was sung softly, with a lilt that bent each note into tenderness. The words floated through the little speaker like a ghost leaning over a cradle, and I knew that voice. It was the same voice that once filled this very house years ago when my daughter would rock her baby brother to sleep. She had a way of wrapping music around a child like a blanket. That was her gift, her voice was her love, but my daughter was gone. She had been gone for many years. The mug slipped in my hands. Tea spilled across the counter, but I hardly noticed. My heart thundered so loud I wondered if the baby upstairs could hear it. I pressed the monitor closer to my ear. The lullaby swelled, carrying a melody etched into my bones. The words were Spanish, ones my own mother once sang to me, Cielito Lindo. It was not a song you found on radio stations. It was not one you'd hear in the background of commercials or television shows. It was ours. My mother's, then mine, then my daughter's. And now it was floating back to me through a plastic box on my kitchen table. I rose to my feet so quickly the chair screeched against the tile. My hands were shaking. I crossed the room, bumping into the corner of the counter, nearly dropping the monitor. How could this be? I told myself perhaps my daughter-in-law had learned the song. Maybe she was upstairs, singing to her child. But no, her accent was different, her voice too sharp on the edges. This voice was warm honey, the voice of my daughter, my lost child. I stumbled toward the staircase. The monitor clutched like a lifeline. The closer I drew, the clearer it became. The song wasn't in the room with me. It wasn't even in the house. It was inside the machine, as though time itself had been bottled and was now pouring into my ears. I froze halfway up the stairs, my legs locked. My body trembled so fiercely that I gripped the banister to stay upright. It couldn't be real. She was gone. I had buried her memory in photographs and pressed flowers, in the ache that dulled but never healed. I had whispered prayers to her empty room. I had taught myself to live with absence. And yet here she was, her voice, alive, humming through a monitor meant only to capture the cry of a child. I pressed my forehead to the wood of the banister. My breath came fast, short, like a woman running from a fire. I wanted to climb the rest of the stairs, to fling open the nursery door, to see with my own eyes who sat by that crib, but fear held me still. Fear that the door would be empty and I would find nothing. Fear that opening it would break the spell and the voice would vanish forever. So I stood there, frozen between floors, suspended between the life I knew and the one I once had. The song continued, a lullaby without hurry. My heart ached as though someone had reached inside my chest and tightened their hand around it. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it ended. The monitor hissed back into static. I remained on the stairs for a long time after, the silence heavier than any silence I had known before. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in my chair until dawn, the baby monitor on the table, daring it to speak again. My tea grew cold. My bones stiffened, but my heart refused to rest, because I knew what I had heard. A mother knows, and in that knowing came a whisper of something I had not felt in years: hope. When morning finally came, the light looked different. The curtains glowed pale gold, but instead of warming me, the brightness felt like an interrogation lamp. I had spent the night in a half-trance, listening for a voice that never returned, clutching the baby monitor as though it might burst into song again at any moment. I set it down on the kitchen table, its plastic frame dull in the daylight, and rubbed my eyes. My son came downstairs, tie in one hand, coffee in the other. He glanced at me, then at the cold tea, the sleepless lines etched under my eyes. "You didn't go to bed?" he asked. I shook my head. "The baby was restless," I said quickly. The words were easier than the truth. How could I tell him that I heard his sister, the one he had mourned years ago, singing to his child through a machine? He nodded without pressing. He had learned long ago not to pry too much into my silences. Grief had taught us both the art of avoidance. When he left for work, the house fell quiet again, save for the little sighs of the baby upstairs. I moved slowly through the rooms, dusting, folding, doing all the things a mother does when she doesn't know what else to do with her hands. But with every step, my mind wandered back to my daughter. Her name was Grace. She was the light of my youth, my firstborn, the girl who used to scribble poems in the margins of her notebooks and tuck daisies into her hair. She had a laugh that made even the hardest days feel like summer. And she had that voice, clear, lilting, untrained, but beautiful. She died 12 years ago, or so I was told. A car accident, they said. A late-night drive back from a friend's house. Rain on the roads. The phone call that came after midnight. The funeral. The condolences. The flowers wilting on the kitchen counter. But even in those first days, something inside me had refused to accept it fully. The coffin was closed, the explanations vague. I asked questions, but people hushed me with their eyes. They said grief was twisting my thoughts. They said I had to let go, so I did, at least outwardly. I folded away her clothes. I boxed up her journals. I tucked photographs into albums and pressed the albums into drawers, out of sight, out of reach, but not out of mind. Never out of mind. Now here I was, 12 years later, hearing her voice again. I sat at the kitchen table and pulled open the drawer where I had hidden her belongings. A faded shoebox, the cardboard edges fraying, waited inside. My hands trembled as I lifted it out. Dust rose like a sigh. Inside were scraps of a life. A ribbon she wore at prom, ticket stubs from the county fair, a folded piece of paper with lyrics she had written in her looping script. I traced the ink with my finger. She had written the first lines of the same lullaby I heard last night. "Can't a why no lores," she had scrawled. "Sing and don't cry." Tears blurred the words. I could still hear her the way she used to be, standing at the foot of her brother's bed, rocking him to sleep with that song. He would clutch his blanket, eyes heavy, and I would watch from the doorway, thinking, this is what love sounds like. I pressed the paper to my chest. My body shook with a longing that had slept for too long. When my daughter-in-law came home that afternoon, I almost asked her. I almost begged her to tell me whether she had ever learned that lullaby. But the thought of being dismissed again, of being told my mind was fraying, stopped me. She already thought I was too sentimental, too fragile. Instead, I kept the secret. I returned the box to the drawer. I made dinner. I rocked my grandson until his eyelids fluttered closed. But that night, when the house settled again into silence, I sat in the dark with the monitor on the table beside me, waiting. The static hissed empty. My heart ached with every minute that passed, and still I waited. For 3 nights, the house gave me nothing but silence. The monitor hissed faintly, as if mocking me, but no melody, no whisper of the song returned. By the fourth night, I began to doubt myself. Had I truly heard it, or had grief, sly as a thief, crept back to steal my reason? During the day, I moved as if under water. My son noticed my distraction but said nothing. My daughter-in-law grew impatient, reminding me not to leave the baby's bottles unwashed or the laundry unfinished. I nodded and did as she asked, though my mind wandered back to that one haunting night. It was the baby who seemed to know more than any of us. Each time I placed him in the crib, he turned his face to the corner of the room, his little lips curling into a smile at nothing I could see. He laughed once, a sudden giggle that startled me. I leaned over, whispering, "What do you see, sweetheart?" He only cooed, eyes fixed on the air above him. That evening, I wrote in a small notebook I kept hidden in my apron pocket. Baby smiled at nothing. Could it be her? The act of writing gave me comfort. If no one else believed me, the paper would. On the sixth night, I left the monitor beside my bed, the glow of its red light casting a faint halo in the dark. Around midnight, it crackled again. My heart leapt. I held my breath. But this time it was not a lullaby. It was a single word. "Mom." The voice was faint, muffled, as though carried across a great distance, but it was hers. I sat upright, every muscle trembling. I whispered into the darkness, "Grace?" The monitor fell back into static. I pressed it to my ear until the plastic hurt against my skin, but nothing came. Only that word lingered in my chest, a word I had dreamed of hearing again for 12 long years. The next morning, I nearly told my son, but when I opened my mouth, the words dried up. What if he laughed? What if he called a doctor? What if he thought I was losing my mind and tried to take his child from me? So I kept it locked inside. Days became heavy. I burned the toast, misplaced my glasses, forgot to collect the mail. My daughter-in-law shook her head and muttered about getting older. I let her think so. It was easier than explaining. But at night, the unease grew. I began leaving the monitor on during dinner, while folding laundry, even while I watered the flowers in the garden. I wanted proof. Something I could hold up to the light and say, "See? She's still here." One afternoon, I set the monitor beside me on the porch while the baby napped upstairs. The cicadas buzzed, the air heavy with summer heat. Then, so faint I almost missed it, I heard humming. Just 2 bars of the lullaby, like someone reminding me they had not forgotten. I dropped the watering can. Water spilled across the porch, but I hardly noticed. I clutched the monitor and whispered, "Please say something again." The humming stopped. That night, I dreamed of her. She stood at the end of my bed, not the young woman I lost, but older, closer to the age she would be now. Her hair fell around her shoulders, her eyes wide, almost pleading. She opened her mouth to speak, but I woke before hearing the words. The monitor glowed quietly on the nightstand. I began to wonder if the house itself held her, if the walls had memorized her voice the way I had, and on certain nights, when the world was still, they released her back to me in fragments. But a deeper thought gnawed at me. What if she was alive? What if somewhere, not far from here, she was whispering into some unseen wire, her voice finding its way into this house like a message in a bottle? The possibility both terrified and electrified me, so I did what any mother would do when hope, however fragile, flares in the dark. I waited. I wrote more notes in my book. Night 3, nothing. Night 4, nothing. Night 6, she said, "Mom." Afternoon in garden, humming. The notebook became my companion, the witness to my secret. Each line steadied me, even as the uneasiness settled deeper into my bones. On the 8th night, the monitor hissed and sputtered. I leaned in, barely breathing. The lullaby began again, just a whisper at first, then clearer, as though someone were sitting right beside the crib. My throat tightened. My eyes blurred. I pressed my hand to my chest to keep my heart from shattering out of it. And then, for the first time, the baby stirred and cooed along, as if he recognized the voice too. Tears streamed down my face. It was no ghost. It was my daughter. I was sure of it. The days that followed carried a strange heaviness, as though the walls themselves were listening. I moved through the house with the unease of a tenant, not an owner, afraid of what sound might rise from the quiet. It began with footsteps. One afternoon, while folding the baby's onesies in the living room, I heard them upstairs, slow, deliberate steps across the nursery floor. At first, I thought my daughter-in-law had returned early. But when I climbed the stairs, the nursery was empty. The crib was still, the baby asleep, his chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. The air smelled faintly of lavender, the way Grace used to smell after her baths. I stood in the doorway, my hands trembling, afraid to breathe too loudly. The room felt inhabited, alive. The footsteps ceased, but the memory of them lingered. That night, when I set the baby down, I left the monitor switched on and my notebook beside it. Each time the static shifted, I held my pen ready, but no song came, only the occasional creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the house settling. Still, I wrote, "Footsteps above me today, nursery smelled of lavender." The notebook was filling quickly. A few days later, I carried the baby in his stroller through the neighborhood, hoping the fresh air would lift the weight pressing down on me. As I passed Mrs. Reynolds, the neighbor who often tended her roses, she called out, "Your daughter is so beautiful." I stopped in my tracks. "I beg your pardon, Mrs." Reynolds wiped her gloves on her apron and smiled. "The young woman who looks so much like you. I saw her walking past just yesterday evening down toward the corner store. Long dark hair, delicate face." I waved, but she didn't answer. The ground shifted beneath me. I forced a smile, thanked her, and hurried on. Inside, my thoughts screamed. Was it possible? Had Grace been walking the very street where she once rode her bike as a girl? That evening, I could not eat. My son asked if I felt well, and I mumbled something about the heat. He kissed my forehead and told me to rest, but rest was impossible. I waited until the house was dark, then opened the box of her belongings again. The ribbon, the ticket stubs, the folded lyrics. Each item was a tether to the past, but now they felt like clues to a mystery still unfolding. When I closed the lid, I heard it, a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the windows were shut. The whisper came from the hallway, faint and hurried, like someone speaking through cupped hands. I rose and followed it, each step heavier than the last. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered. My heart beat against my ribs like a fist. At the end of the hall, outside the nursery, I paused. The whisper ceased. The baby slept soundly, one tiny hand curled near his face. But the air was not still. It pulsed with a presence like someone had just left. I whispered into the room, "Grace, silence." I sank to the rocking chair, tears brimming, and sat there until dawn. The next morning, as I poured milk into my coffee, my son's voice startled me. "Mom, you left the monitor on all night." I glanced at it. The red light glowed steady, its small body humming. "I wanted to be sure the baby slept," I said. He studied me, worry clouding his face. For a moment, I feared he might take it away, fearing it was feeding my obsession. But he only sighed and kissed the baby's head before heading to work. Later, as I carried the laundry basket upstairs, I noticed something that chilled me. A framed photograph of Grace, the one that had always sat on the dresser in my bedroom, was missing. In its place was a faint square of dust where the frame had rested for years. I searched every room, every surface. It was gone. No one admitted to moving it. That night, I dreamed again. Grace stood in the hallway, holding the missing frame. She pressed it to her chest, eyes wide with fear. When I reached for her, she whispered, "Mom, find me." Then she faded like smoke. I woke drenched in sweat, the monitor hissing beside me. I opened the notebook and wrote, "Photo missing," whispered words, "Find me." Neighbor saw a girl like her. Lavender smell, footsteps. The list was growing into a map of something larger, something I could no longer ignore. Each clue told me the same truth. My daughter had not left me. She was here, somewhere, waiting to be found. I searched for the missing picture for 2 days. It was not in the bedroom, nor on the hallway shelf where I sometimes dusted, nor in the drawers I rarely opened. It had vanished as if carried away by invisible hands. The photograph itself had always been ordinary. Grace at 17, standing in front of the high school gymnasium, her hair swept back by the wind, her smile uneven but radiant. I loved that photo because it captured her unguarded, free of pose. When she was gone, I had framed it in brass and set it on my dresser, a piece of her I could greet each morning. Now, the emptiness where it had rested taunted me every time I passed. On the third day I found it. It was lying face down on the floor of the nursery near the crib. My heart hammered as I bent to pick it up. The glass was not cracked, the frame not dented. But there was a faint smudge across her face, as though someone had touched it with damp fingers. I pressed the photo to my chest, whispering her name. Grace. I could not understand how it had traveled there. My daughter-in-law swore she hadn't seen it. My son shook his head, distracted, barely listening. No one admitted to moving it, and yet there it was, where only a child or a ghost might have placed it. That night, I set the photo on the kitchen table and studied it in the glow of a single lamp. I traced her smile with my fingertip. A memory surfaced. Grace, at 10 years old, holding her little brother in her arms, humming the same lullaby, Si Lido Lindo. I remembered how she rocked him so gently, as though she already understood the fragility of life. The monitor crackled on the counter. My breath caught. At first, only static. Then the faintest melody, the same lullaby. This time I whispered back. Grace, I'm here. The singing paused. Then a low hum continued as though she had heard me. I clutched the photograph and pressed it to the monitor. My tears fell freely now, sliding down the glass and spotting her smile. I begged, please, if you are alive, let me find you. If you are gone, tell me why I can still hear you. The hum faded into silence. The next morning, I went to the attic. Dust clung to my arms as I opened old boxes of keepsakes. I was searching for anything that might explain the unexplainable. In a shoebox labeled Grace School Years, I found journals, sketch pads, scraps of paper with her looping handwriting. One page stopped me cold. It was a half-finished letter. Mom, it began. If you ever read this, it means I didn't have the courage to tell you face to face. They want me to leave. I don't know if I'll ever come back. Please forgive me. The ink smeared at the edge of the page as though she had closed the notebook in haste. My knees buckled. I sat on the attic floor, clutching the letter, my pulse thundering in my ears. She hadn't written of death, of accidents, of endings. She had written of leaving under someone else's command. I whispered her name into the still attic air, my voice trembling. Who wanted you to go, Grace? Who kept you from me? For hours, I sat in the dust, replaying every memory of the weeks before her disappearance, the hushed phone calls, the late-night walks, the way she avoided my gaze. I had blamed youth, hormones, the stubbornness of a 17-year-old. But now I saw the truth in a sharper light. She had been afraid. I carried the letter downstairs and hid it inside my notebook of recent clues. Together they told a story I could no longer ignore. Footsteps, lavender, whispers, missing photo, humming, letter. The evidence was stacking like stones on my chest. That evening, I placed the photograph on the mantel above the fireplace. I wanted it where no one could move it without my notice. But later that night, when the house fell into quiet, I heard the faint scrape of glass against wood. I rushed into the living room. The photograph had slid sideways, tilted as if nudged by unseen hands, and from the monitor, still resting on the kitchen table, came a whisper I will never forget. Mom, look for me. I dropped to my knees, the room spinning. I had proof now, not just memories, not just grief playing tricks. Words, clear and pleading, had traveled across the static. My daughter was reaching for me, and I would not let her down. I could not carry the weight of the whispers and photographs alone. My notebook filled with clues like a courtroom file, but no jury sat to hear them, no judge to confirm I wasn't mad. Still, my heart knew. Mothers know. and the truth pressed against me like a door ready to burst. One afternoon, I carried the baby in his stroller down to the pharmacy. The summer sun was bright, but my thoughts were dim. I stopped at the corner for water, and that is when I saw her, an older woman sitting on a bench near the bus stop, a cane propped against her leg. Her face was familiar in a way that made me pause. She was a nurse once. I remembered her from the hospital on the night of Grace's accident. My breath caught. I hadn't seen her in over a decade. She noticed me staring and squinted, then her lips curved into recognition. "Mrs. Carter?" she asked. I nodded, my throat tightening. "You worked at St. Mary's, didn't you?" "I did," she said, her voice raspy but gentle. "Too many years to count." I hesitated, then sat beside her, the stroller's wheels squeaking as I locked them in place. The baby gurgled softly. I folded my hands in my lap. "Do you remember my daughter, Grace?" I asked, my voice trembling on her name. Her eyes shifted. For a moment, she looked away as though studying the traffic. Then she lowered her voice. "Yes, I do." Something inside me flared, hope, fear, anger all at once. "They told me she died that night, a car accident, but I've heard her voice. I've seen signs, please, if you know anything." She raised her hand, stopping me. "You need to be careful, Mrs. Carter. There are things you were never told." My pulse pounded. "Tell me, please. I've lived with silence long enough." The nurse sighed, her shoulders sagging under years of secrets. That night was not what they said. There was no body brought to the morgue. Only a girl admitted with injuries, confused, scared. They told me not to write her name on the charts. Just Jane Doe. The world tilted around me. "You mean Grace?" She looked at me, her eyes heavy. "I can't say for certain. I was told to keep my distance. But she matched your daughter's description. Dark hair, slender build. She kept asking for her mother." My hands shook so violently I had to grip the bench. Why didn't anyone tell me? The nurse leaned closer, her whisper a thread. "Because someone powerful didn't want you to know. There were men in suits that night, not hospital staff. They signed papers, moved her to another wing, then she was gone. By morning the bed was empty, records erased." I gasped, tears spilling down my cheeks. "Gone? Where?" She shook her head. "I don't know. All I know is that girl wasn't dead. She was alive, and someone made sure you believed otherwise." The baby whimpered, sensing my shaking. I bent to soothe him, pressing his tiny hand against my cheek. My tears wet his skin. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because," the nurse said, eyes glistening, "I've carried it for too long. I'm old now. Secrets rot the heart. If your daughter is still out there, you deserve the chance to find her." She squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "But be careful. Whoever hit her once may not want her found." I wanted to ask more, but the bus arrived. She stood, leaning on her cane. "I take this route every week," she said softly. "If you need me again, you know where to find me." Then she boarded and was gone. I sat frozen on that bench long after, the stroller at my side. The cars passed, the sun dipped lower, but my world had shifted forever. Grace had not died. She had been hidden. Stolen? That evening, I could not bring myself to cook dinner. My son reheated leftovers while I sat at the table, staring at the monitor as though it might bring me more answers. My daughter-in-law muttered about my absent mind, but I barely heard her. When the house finally settled, I opened my notebook and wrote. Spoke to nurse. Grace alive that night. Jane Doe. Men in suits. Records erased. Someone wanted her gone. The pen dug into the paper with each word. As I closed the book, the monitor hissed, and then faint but clear came the lullaby again. This time I didn't cry. I whispered into the static, steady and fierce, "Grace, I will find you. No one will keep you from me again." The melody quivered as if in answer, and for the first time in years, I felt not only grief, not only longing. I felt purpose. The nurse's words would not leave me. Alive, hidden, taken away by men in suits. I carried them like a brand on my chest. Every chore, every lullaby I hummed to my grandson, every moment I poured milk into a glass or folded shirts into a drawer, those words pulsed beneath the surface, She was alive. That night, the baby monitor hissed again. I sat at the kitchen table, notebook open, pen trembling in my hand. At first, only static. Then, faint humming. Not the full lullaby, just a thread of melody, repeating like a code. I leaned closer, heart pounding. The pitch rose and fell in a rhythm I recognized, not from the song itself but from memory. Grace had once made a game of whistling to call her brother in from the yard. 3 short notes, one long. He would laugh, run to her, shouting, "I hear you." Now those same notes threaded through the static. I clapped my hand over my mouth. She wasn't just singing, she was signaling. I pressed the monitor against my ear, determined to catch every nuance. Between the hums, there was something else. A faint crack, a shuffle, then a sound I hadn't noticed before, a distant train whistle. My pulse quickened. There were no train tracks near our neighborhood. The nearest station was miles away near the edge of town. Could that be where she was? The idea rooted itself inside me. The next morning, I packed a small bag, tucked my notebook inside, and told my son I was running errands. He nodded distractedly, too busy rushing to work to ask questions. I drove until the city thinned into fields, until the old rail yard came into view, rusting and forgotten. Beyond it, a scattering of houses leaned against one another like weary shoulders. Paint peeled, roofs sagged. It was the kind of place where people lived unseen, where secrets could hide in plain sight. I parked at the corner and stepped out, pulling my shawl tight. My heart rattled in my chest. I carried the baby monitor with me, absurd though it seemed, as if it might guide me. I switched it on. Static filled the air. I walked slowly, eyes darting to each house. And then, faint as a breath, the hum began again. 3 short notes. One long, my knees buckled. I gripped the fence post to steady myself. The sound was coming clearer now, as though I were drawing closer. I followed it down a narrow alley littered with bicycles and broken toys. The houses pressed close, their walls stained with years of rain. At the far end stood a small wooden house, its paint once white but now grayed with neglect. A curtain shifted in the window as I approached. The humming stopped. My breath caught. I stood before the door, hand trembling inches from the knob. The world hushed. Even the birds seemed to pause. I wanted to knock, to burst in, to shout her name. But fear held me. What if I was wrong? What if I frightened her away? Or worse, what if I found only strangers inside? Before I could decide, the door creaked open a sliver. A woman's profile appeared in the gap. Dark hair, familiar shape. My chest constricted so tightly I thought I might collapse. "Grace," I whispered. The woman froze, her eyes widened, startled. For a moment, I thought she would speak. Instead, she slammed the door shut, the echo ricocheting down the alley. I stumbled back, heart hammering. My body shook from head to toe. It was her. I knew it with every fiber of my being. She was alive, she was here, and she was afraid. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening for movement inside. None came. The house remained silent, a fortress of secrets. Finally, with my legs too weak to hold me, I turned and walked back toward my car. The monitor hissed in my hand. Then, just as I reached the corner, the lullaby floated through again, softer now, fragile as a thread. It was her way of saying, "I see you." I pressed the monitor to my chest, tears spilling down my cheeks. I whispered into the night air, "I will come back, I promise." When I returned home, the house looked the same, dishes stacked in the sink, toys scattered across the floor, but nothing was the same. I was no longer a woman haunted by memories. I was a mother with proof. I sat at the kitchen table, opened my notebook and wrote with steady hands, followed the voice. Train whistle. Allie, wooden house, saw her. She ran, alive. The words stared back at me like scripture. I closed the book, placed the photograph beside it, and listened to the monitor hum. For the first time in 12 years, the silence of my house no longer felt like an ending. It felt like a beginning. Sleep no longer visited me gently. Each night I closed my eyes, I saw that door slam shut, saw the startled face in the gap of wood and shadow. My daughter, my Grace, was alive, but she was not free. That knowledge pulsed through me like a second heartbeat, restless, relentless. I began to search our house as if it were a crime scene. Closets, attics, drawers I hadn't opened in years. I pulled them all apart, convinced that if Grace had been hidden once, the clues to her truth must be hidden too. It was in the attic, beneath a box of old winter coats, that I found it, a small spiral notebook wrapped in a scarf. The cover was bent, pages yellowed, but when I saw the handwriting, my knees buckled. Grace's looping script, the way she always dotted her eyes with heavy pressure. I pressed it to my chest before daring to open it. The first pages were what you'd expect of a teenage girl, lists of favorite songs, doodles of flowers, poems about boys she never named. But deeper in, the words grew darker. Mom doesn't see it yet, but something is happening. They keep telling me to stay quiet. I felt my breath catch. Someone keeps calling the house when she isn't home. A man's voice. He says things that scare me. He says if I don't do what they ask, I'll regret it. I can't tell Mom. She won't believe me. She'll think I'm being dramatic. My hands trembled so violently the pages shook. Another entry. Tonight they followed me after work, 2 men in suits. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. I knew they were watching. I wanted to scream, but who would hear me? I wish Mom knew. I wish I had her courage. Tears blurred the ink, but I forced myself to read on. They say I have to leave soon, that it's for the best, that my family will be safer without me. I don't want to go. God, I don't want to go. The final page ended mid-sentence, as if she'd been interrupted. I keep thinking about the song Grandma sang. Maybe if I sing it, she'll find me. Maybe, and then nothing. I closed the notebook, my chest heaving. She had been crying out even then, but I had missed it, blinded by the rhythm of laundry and dinners and ordinary days. I wanted to scream at the woman I once was. How could you not see? How could you not hear her fear? But regret is a cruel companion. It whispers only when it's too late. I carried the diary downstairs and set it on the kitchen table beside the baby monitor. The 2 objects looked like bookends of a story that refused to stay buried, her voice and her words echoing across time. That night, I turned on the monitor as usual, the diary open in front of me. I traced her last unfinished sentence with my finger. Maybe if I sing it, she'll find me. Static hissed. Then, as if on cue, the lullaby began. This time, I did not cry. I sang with it. My voice cracked, but I pushed through, joining hers across the years. Each note felt like a bridge laid between us, a promise that I would not abandon her again. When the melody faded, I whispered into the hum, "I found your words, Grace. I hear you now. I'm coming." The static softened, almost like a sigh. In the morning, I returned to the attic and searched the scarf that had hidden the diary. Tucked inside was a scrap of paper with an address scribbled faintly in pencil. My heart raced as I read it, a street near the train yard, the same place I had followed the voice. Proof. I slipped the paper into my notebook. The pieces were aligning, the nurse's confession, the photograph's disappearance, the diary's plea. She was alive, and she was waiting for me to be brave enough to claim her. That evening, when I rocked my grandson to sleep, I hummed Cielito Lindo. His small eyes fluttered closed, and for a moment I imagined I was rocking both of them, him and Grace, one in my arms, the other in my heart. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "Your aunt is out there, and we will bring her home." Then I set the diary on the mantel, beside the photograph, like twin torches to light the path ahead. No more denial. No more silence. The truth had been hidden in my own house all along, and now that I had found it, there was no turning back. The diary burned in my hands like a living thing. I could not carry its words alone any longer. If Grace had been forced to leave, if someone had whispered threats into her young ears, then someone I loved had known more than they ever confessed. And there was only one person left to ask: my ex-husband. He lived on the other side of town, in a small house with shutters that sagged and a porch that creaked. We had been divorced for years, our conversations reduced to brief exchanges about birthdays or holidays. But that night, as the sun bled into the horizon, I drove to his door with the diary pressed against my chest. He opened the door slowly, his hair grayer, his eyes dulled by time. "What are you doing here?" he asked, suspicion already sharp in his voice. I stepped inside without answering. The air smelled faintly of whiskey. "I need to talk about Grace," I said. His shoulders stiffened. He turned away as though reaching for something on the counter, but I knew it was to avoid my eyes. "We buried her, remember?" I slammed the diary on the table. The sound startled him. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "We buried a lie." He frowned, glancing at the notebook. His hand hovered above it but didn't touch. "What's this?" Her words, I whispered. "Her fear. She wrote that men followed her, that she was being forced to leave, and you knew." His lips pressed thin. A long silence stretched between us, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. At last, he exhaled heavily, like a man releasing a secret he'd hoped would never surface. "I tried to protect you," he muttered. "Protect me?" My voice rose. "From what? From the truth that our daughter was alive and you let her be taken?" He rubbed his temples. "You don't understand. She got mixed up with someone powerful. A man with money, influence. He came to me, told me if I didn't keep quiet, our whole family would suffer. He said Grace had to go away." The room swayed. "And you believed him? What choice did I have?" His voice cracked. "He showed me papers, court threats, things that could ruin us. He said it was the only way to keep her safe, that if she stayed, worse would happen." I shook my head, fury and sorrow crashing together. "Safe? You call tearing her from her family safe. You let her walk into the arms of strangers, and you told me she was dead. You let me grieve for 12 years. He lowered his gaze, shame pooling in his eyes. "I thought it was kinder. You wouldn't have survived knowing she was alive but out of reach." Tears streamed down my face. "You robbed me of choice. You robbed me of hope." The baby monitor in my bag crackled suddenly, startling us both. I pulled it out, clutching it like a talisman. Through the static, faint humming began, the lullaby, as if Grace herself were listening to this confrontation, urging me on. He stared at the monitor, his face pale. "What is that?" "Proof," I said, my voice steel. "Proof that she's still near. I've followed the voice. I've seen her, and I will not stop until she's back where she belongs." His hands trembled. "If you find her, they won't let her go easily. You don't know these people." "I don't care who they are," I spat. "I'm her mother, and a mother doesn't stop." The monitor hummed louder for a moment, then faded into static again. I felt Grace in that silence, her courage, her plea. I gathered the diary and turned to the door. "You can drown in your guilt if you want, but I will fight for her, with or without you." He didn't follow me. His silhouette sagged in the doorway as I stepped back into the night air. Driving home, I replayed every word he had said. Powerful men. Threats. Lies told to protect reputations, not daughters. The picture sharpened in my mind. Grace hadn't run away. She had been erased, deliberately, cruelly. When I returned, the house was dark, my son and daughter-in-law asleep, the baby breathing softly in his crib. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my notebook, confronted him. He admitted knowing. Powerful man forced her to leave, said it was for her safety. Lied to me, lied to all of us. I pressed the pen so hard it nearly tore the page. Then I added one final line: "I will find her, even if I have to burn down the lies myself." The monitor hissed, faint and steady, like an ally breathing beside me in the dark. And for the first time in years, I wasn't just a grieving mother. I was a warrior. The days that followed were not days at all, but countdowns. Every hour ticked louder than the last, a drumbeat urging me forward. My ex-husband's confession had stripped away the last layer of doubt. Grace was alive. She had been hidden by lies and power, but she had never been gone. I returned to the address scribbled in her diary, the one near the train yard. This time I did not go alone. My younger sister, Carol, insisted on coming when she saw the fire in my eyes and the trembling in my hands. "You shouldn't face this alone," she said, gripping my arm. "If she's there, she'll need to see more than one loving face. She'll need to know she still belongs." So we drove together, the baby monitor on the seat between us, hissing like an old friend. The alley was as I remembered: bicycles rusting, trash cans tipped, shadows stretching too long for the afternoon sun. The wooden house leaned as if weary of standing. My heart thudded as I approached, Grace's photograph clenched in my hand. I knocked, once, twice. The door opened just a sliver like before. A woman's eye peered out. "Grace," I whispered. The eye widened. The door opened wider, revealing her face. It was older now, worn by years I had not been given to witness. But it was hers. The same high cheekbones, the same dark eyes that once lit up my kitchen when she told me about school dances and favorite songs. My breath caught in my throat. She froze, her hand gripping the edge of the door as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. Tears welled in her eyes. "Mom!" The word shattered me. I stumbled forward, nearly collapsing, my hands reaching out. She hesitated only a second before stepping into my arms. I held her, and the years melted away. She was not 29, a woman forced into hiding. She was my little girl again, the one who scribbled poems and hummed lullabies, trembling in my embrace. We both wept deep, unguarded sobs that shook our bodies. Carol stood nearby, wiping her eyes, whispering prayers under her breath. When the storm of tears eased, I cupped Grace's face in my hands. "Why didn't you come home? Why didn't you tell me?" Her lips trembled. "They said you would be hurt if I did, that they would destroy our family. I wanted to call to write, but they watched me, always." Her voice broke. "I thought you gave up on me." I shook my head fiercely. "Never. I grieved you, but I never stopped loving you. I heard your voice, Grace. Through the monitor, you've been calling me." She gasped, covering her mouth. "I sang the lullaby sometimes when I couldn't bear the silence. I prayed you'd hear me somehow. I didn't know." I held her tighter. "I heard you. I followed you. And nothing, no lie, no man in a suit, no threat will keep me from you again." Behind her, the small house was dim, the furniture sparse. A mattress lay on the floor, blankets folded neatly. On the table sat a cracked teacup and an old radio. The air smelled faintly of lavender, the same scent that had haunted the nursery weeks before. She noticed me looking. "I stayed here because it was close enough to see you sometimes. From the corner, from the street. I wanted to knock, but I couldn't. Fear kept me prisoner." I kissed her forehead. "You're free now, do you hear me? You're coming home." Her body trembled against mine. "What if they find me?" "They won't," I said, my voice steady as stone. "Not while I breathe." The baby monitor in my bag crackled then, as if affirming my promise. We both turned toward the sound. For the first time, she smiled. A fragile, broken smile, but a smile all the same. Carol placed her hand on Grace's shoulder. "Your mother is right. You're not alone anymore." Grace wiped her tears, her eyes moving between us. Do you think he still remembers me?" It took me a moment to realize she meant her brother, my son. I swallowed hard. He never stopped. He buried his grief deep, but he never forgot. And your nephew, he already knows your voice. He smiles whenever he hears it. Her eyes widened, more tears spilling. "My nephew?" "Yes," I said softly. "The child you've been singing to without knowing it. He has your lullaby in his heart already." We stood together in that narrow alley, mother, daughter, sister, all bound by tears and promises. The years of separation had scarred us, but the bond remained, stubborn and unbroken. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, painting the sky with streaks of orange and violet, Grace whispered, "Can we go home, Mom?" I held her hand as tightly as I could. "Yes, sweetheart, it's time." We walked back toward the car, her steps hesitant at first, then stronger with each stride. The monitor hissed quietly in my bag, but in my heart, I no longer needed it, because her voice was no longer a whisper in the static. It was here, beside me, alive. The house did not feel the same once Grace returned. It was brighter, lighter, as if every corner had been waiting for her footsteps to echo again. The baby laughed more, reaching for her with tiny hands that seemed to recognize her presence. My son, her brother, stood frozen the first time he saw her. His coffee cup slipped from his hands, shattering on the kitchen floor, but he didn't even flinch. He simply walked to her, placed his trembling hands on her shoulders, and whispered, "I thought you were gone." Grace sobbed into his chest, the years of distance vanishing in the warmth of his embrace. I watched them, my children, reunited at last, and I felt something inside me knit together. A wound, long torn open, began to heal. For days, we moved carefully, as though afraid the truth might dissolve if we spoke too loudly. Grace told her story in fragments, pieces of a puzzle she could barely touch without shaking. The threats, the men who followed her, the isolation in small houses where she was told to stay silent. She admitted she sang at night, hoping her voice might travel to me somehow. She never knew it had. I listened without interrupting, though each word was a knife. To know she had lived those years in fear broke me, but the fact that she was here now, alive and safe, mended me in equal measure. In the evenings, we sat together in the living room. The baby monitor still hummed, but I no longer needed it. I heard her voice not through static, but across the table as she hummed to her nephew, her song filling the air like incense. One night, as the baby fell asleep in her arms, she looked at me with eyes both weary and hopeful. "Can we really start over?" she asked. I took her free hand and held it tightly. "We can't erase the years, Grace, but we can fill the ones ahead. That's what matters now." She smiled, small but real, and I knew she believed me. The neighbors whispered when they saw her, uncertain how to reconcile a ghost returned. Some asked questions, others offered cautious embraces. But inside our walls, we made no apologies. We celebrated with meals around the table, with laughter that had been absent too long, with the simple joy of hearing her footsteps on the stairs. For the first time in 12 years, I no longer felt like a mother clinging to memory. I was a mother of two again, a grandmother to a child who would grow up knowing not only the story of loss, but the miracle of reunion. The past still hurt. The scars remained. But hope had grown in their place, stronger than grief, brighter than fear. And so, dear listener, that is the story I wanted to share. A story of a mother who refused to stop listening. A story of a daughter who sang through the silence. A story of a family broken by lies but mended by love. If you take anything from it, let it be this: never dismiss the voice that echoes in your heart. It may be memory, it may be longing, but sometimes it may be the truth calling you back to what you thought you had lost. Thank you for walking with me through this journey, through nights of static and whispers, through tears and reunion. Your time, your attention, your compassion mean more than you know. I wish you health, peace, and the strength to hold your own families close. May your homes be filled with laughter, may your tables be surrounded by love, and may your nights be free of silence except for the songs of those you cherish most. From my family to yours, stay safe, stay strong, and remember, love never dies.